call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show thee great and mighty things which thou knowest not. Jeremiah 33:3.
King James.
King James, yes. Hidden and fenced in, if you're in Amplified, or I
something
believe
else.
Darby's translation, yes, several other translations. Here you go. Welcome to the program, Great and Mighty Things. On my left is our host, Reverend Bob Butler from Agape and Praise Fellowship. I am his more or less steady co-host. Been around with him since we started in 87. And I'm Kendall Hetrick from Last Adam Ministries, and our address now is at Carmen. And here on my right is the head of Gerald Connaught Ministries, and he has some of his fan club here with him today, or at least his wife. And we have, if you hear a little extemporaneous noise more so today, it's because we have a little larger live audience than we generally do.
Usually, yes.
Yeah. Now, we're going to be going back through, we're dealing with covenant, and Bob and Jerry are going to bring us up to speed here a little bit on covenant and the Abrahamic covenant and some of the signs of it. So get your Bible, hopefully you've already started your tape recorder and are recording this, and so study along with us, and we'll get into covenant.
Amen. Well,
You want me to jump in?
thank you for being on the program, Jerry.
Okay.
We're glad to have you come on and join us. We've been talking about in the last programs about the Abrahamic covenant, or the Abram covenant, and we started in there and talked about that pretty extensively, along with the one that David made with Jonathan. And the one that's significant to us as Christians is the one that God made with Abram, because that's one of the beginning covenants that had significance to us. And we're going to talk about some of the things that were contingent to that down through the generations. So Jerry's going to read something from Genesis, and then I'll go over to Leviticus, and we'll tie these together. And it talks about one of the physical things that God had the people do as a reminder of the covenant that he made with Abram. And it was to pass down from generation to generation. And then we'll get into some other aspects of this. So go ahead if you...
Yeah, if the people want to look at Genesis 17, they really need the whole chapter
Right.
to really get the full context of this. But let's begin looking at verse 10. It says, "This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you." Now let's just stop right there, because this is God speaking to Abram.
Exactly.
Before anything is done, before he became Abraham.
Yes.
This is God beginning to draw out the context of this covenant that he is making with this man Abraham, who he saw to be one to fulfill. And actually he was speaking prophetically to his seed, which is Christ,
Exactly.
in this. So he knew that Abram was going to fulfill this covenant because he was sending Jesus through that bloodline.
And we get to Hebrews, it'll come out even stronger.
It'll come out a lot stronger, I think. But so in verse 11, he says, "This is the token of the covenant betwixt me and you." And I think it was either the last program or the program before that, we talked about the cutting of the
Yes.
sacrificial
Yes.
animal in
Yes.
half and walking through the blood and that whole aspect there. This is a sign, an outward sign, which also required some cutting,
Shedding of
the
blood.
covenant, to cut,
Yes.
and the blood flow of some sort, which we talked about too. So that's relevant to any covenant that is involved.
Exactly.
And then verse 12 he says, "And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you. Every man-child in your generations, he that is born in the house, or bought with money of any stranger, which is not of thy seed. He that is born in thy house, and he that is bought with thy money, must needs be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant." Again, that re-emphasizing that the cutting was the token of that covenant between Abram and God. In verse 14, "And the uncircumcised man-child, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant." So if there was not that circumcision, there was a breaking of the covenant, and
There-
God was not responsible for that person.
They were disregarding what God had told them to do relevant to the
Yeah.
covenant that was made with Abram.
So they didn't have that covenant.
That's right.
Yeah.
They were cut off from it. They weren't legally allowed for the blessings of that covenant because they had
correct.
not obeyed.
Yeah.
And we can go over to Leviticus, and I explained, the book of Leviticus is set up, it's actually the book of law, and God had separated the tribe of Levi to be the priests for the group of that time, and the priestly tribe, or the Levite tribe, were to administer the laws that were put forth in this book of Leviticus. And it was their responsibility to make sure that the country kept on down through the generations what God had intended, so that they could be blessed and leading up to the ultimate covenant, which we talked about in the last program. I'm in Leviticus chapter 12. I'm going to read the first 3 verses, which goes right along with what Jerry has just talked about. And we're doing this primarily to bring the attention to you that God, when He makes a covenant, He also gives you reminders so you can go right on down so you don't forget the covenant. And He's done that even in the New Testament, which we may not get to that in this series of programs, but we'll get to the point where even in the covenant that we live in, God has given us reminders to bring back to remembrance to our generation the covenant that we live in. But in this point in time, it was in a flesh sense, and it was done for their remembrance. And reading in verse 1, it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, If a woman have conceived seed, and born a man-child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, according to the days of the separation for her infirmity. She shall be unclean. And in the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin," in other words, the child that was born, the male child, his foreskin shall be circumcised. And then he goes on to say, and she shall then continue in the blood of her purifying. He talks about the mother in verse 4. But verse 3 gives them direction. The 8th day, and we're not going to go into it deep in the circumcision side of this, but the 8th day has significance. Even in the medical profession, they'll tell you that the 8th day for circumcising a male baby is significant. But here he's saying that this is again a reminder of the covenant that I've made with Father Abraham. Now, going on from there, we get into the Ark of the Covenant. And we could go to Deuteronomy chapter 2. And I have a question for the people watching, and we're going to answer it. But in the Ark of the Covenant, now the Ark of the Covenant is primarily a vessel of which the covenant was housed and transferred from place to place as they moved about the countryside. Deuteronomy chapter 2, and I didn't get there yet. Chapter 10, verse 2. I'm sorry, I've even gotten the wrong pew here. In chapter 10 of Deuteronomy, verse 2, it says, "And I will write on the tablets the words that were in the first tablets, which thou breakest, and thou shalt put them in the ark." So we see here, in the Ark of the Covenant, the things that are in that ark, that are sacred to God, were the tablets of the 10 Commandments that He had given Moses. Now, we know if you go back through and study this out, that the first tablets were broken because He came down to the tribes and they were off in idolatry, and it made Him so angry that He actually broke the tablets and had to go back and get a duplicate set. We just plug in Xerox machine and get a duplicate set today, but He had to go back to the mountain and God had to write some more. But He gave him direction here to put those tablets in the Ark of the Covenant. And then if we go over to Numbers chapter 10, or 17, I mean. Numbers 17, verse 10. Now this may be a little bit out of context of where we left off last time, but this is something that we need to think about along with the covenant that God made with Abraham. In verse 17:10, "And the Lord said to Moses, Bring Aaron's rod again before the testimony, to be kept for a token against the rebels, and thou shalt quite take away their murmurings from me, that they die not. And Moses did so as the Lord commanded him, so he did. Now, if we go to Hebrews chapter 9, it's talking about Aaron's rod and the Ark of the Covenant. And it's bringing back to remembrance to us. Hebrews chapter 9 verse 4 says, well, if we read here, and start in 9, it talks about the tabernacle where all these other things. Then verily the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. And he goes on to explain some of the things. But down in verse 4 it says, which had the golden censer and the Ark of the Covenant overlaid round about with gold, wherein, or inside of the Ark of the Covenant, the golden pot had the manna and Aaron's rod that budded and the tables of the covenant. In other words, these clay stones were the 10 Commandments, were all in the Ark of the Covenant. Now, Kendall, in previous programs, we've talked a little bit about the Ark of the Covenant, how the fact that only the priests could deal with that, because if someone that wasn't of the priestly tribe touched the Ark of the Covenant or come in contact with it without the authority, they sacrificed their life. You want to touch on that a little bit? And
Well, there again, this, we've dealt some of the other, in the other programs with some of the signs, and we're, bringing it back up here that there was those signs of the covenant, and in this, it was to let them realize how serious the covenant was, and so the Ark of the Covenant, which was, this box about half the size of this table or so, with the angels and made out of beaten gold with wood and various other things, which goes ahead and tells about. And that was their point of contact. One of the things that we see especially in the New Testament, is what we call point of contact, and that was their point of contact there with that mercy seat and that yearly expedition, I guess we would call it, of the high priest into that Holy of Holies. And again, we lack time to develop this, because I've got whole books that are dealing with the tabernacle and the type and shadow of it. But this was a shadowing, a physical representation of the meeting place with God with them. And that's where God came into that covenant relationship with us and meets with us. And of course, as we get into the new covenant, we'll see how that operates in and through Christ, and how much better our relationship is with God the Father through Jesus than they had with that physical aspect of that. But that mercy seat was there as a representation, and yearly there was the entrance in of the priest, and he came in and presented blood before that again as a token, as a sign through the law of their being in subjection to the rule and the reign of the one that had set them free from because as we know now, it's the law of sin and death. And they were understanding that, hey, I was without God, without covenant in this earth, and was chosen out through Abraham and through his lineage. And as it came down through the yearly rites and the ceremony of coming down and offering the offerings, and the high priest coming in, they were brought again into an understanding in their thinking process of the penalties for sin, the penalties for breaking the covenant. Of course, as we said in one of the first programs, and we're dealing with this, breaking of the covenant is equated with sin in the old covenant. In the Old Testament, we see that it's breaking of the covenant is what is sin. Now, again, we dealt with a little bit the fact there that they were dealing with it in a physical aspect.
Yes.
You had to physically sin, had to physically do the act, the deed, and then, ultimately on the Day of Atonement, the blood was presented to the mercy seat, and God's mercy, which we'll get into in this series of programs also, was applied to their life and to their situations, and it was there as a physical representation, as a manifestation, saying, okay, I realize the awesomeness of sin. I realize the awesomeness of breaking that covenant, and the reality of it, that blood must be shed for the remission of that sin. Again, and it was just there as a reminder, a yearly reminder to bring that back to the forefront and say, okay, here it is. Kind of like, to a certain degree, we do with the Easter season and the rehearsing, I guess, is the way to say it, what happened through Christ coming as a sacrifice for the new covenant, and then through the resurrection, and so some of the ceremony that was at that time, comes to play in the new covenant. And
Now, you brought out something I want to touch on and bring back again. In the earlier program, when we read out of Deuteronomy the actual covenant agreement between God and Abram, where the smoking furnace and the fiery lamp went through, the animals, we talked about this a little bit, but the animals' blood was shed. When Abram was making covenant with God, his sins had to be covered so that God could have a relationship with him to create this covenant that was being established. Well, the shedding of the animal's blood at that time served a dual purpose. It was the binding agent for the old covenant, or the covenant with Abram, but it was also the covering of the sin of Abram so he could make the covenant with God. Because without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin, or in this case, there's no atoning of sin, a covering of sin. So that the fact that when that happened, that blood served two purposes. Now, we're going to pick up on some more of this as we go through here, some of these other aspects of the blood relevant to the covenant. The covenant is the heart of the whole thing. All these other things are superfluous, but very important, relevant to the covenant. And as we get into Hebrews and some of these other things relevant to the covenant that we live in, then you will see how important the covenant and all the blessings and the cursings of that covenant are to not only in their time, but in our time. That was done at that time that covenant was made. Now, Kendall made a comment that I wrote down for this time. The old covenant was reactive, and he just made a comment about it. After the sin had been made, then they went and made atonement, and they did it yearly. The priests had to go in, and in fact, they even tied a rope around him, because if something messed up, they wanted to be able to pull him out. If you go back and read through there, it tells you about the sacrificing that they had to do. Where the new covenant that we live in, that Jesus made with us, is proactive. We have already had it taken care of, so we don't have to go back daily and say, oh, I need Jesus to shed my blood again, because he's already done it. What we need to do is confess when we miss it, so that we can stay under the covering or the remission of sins that Jesus has already done for us. Because it says in the New Testament, we'll probably get into it, where that remission or that shedding of blood was done once for all.
Amen.
So he doesn't have to do it once a year continually down through the generations, because it's already been accomplished. Now, the other aspect is, we were talking about the old covenant is dealing with the flesh side of man, because they didn't have the knowledge of the importance of the spiritual side of it, like we do with the new covenant. And we get into the fact of circumcision in the new covenant, uncircumcision in the new covenant, which is done from a spiritual point of view versus flesh. And then the fact that the new covenant, it deals with the flesh, but it's also, the main basis is in the spiritual side of life. Did we go to Hebrews 9:4? Yeah, we did. Read that. Let's go to Hebrews 8 then, and pick up. Now, the Ark of the Covenant traveled around wherever they went, and that was where they had to meet with God on a regular basis, which is talked about in Leviticus. The one time was the main shedding of blood, where they went in once a year, but there was also sacrifices during the year, different things that went on, that here again was reactive to what they were doing as they lived their life. But we, through Jesus, he shed his blood, he gave his sinless blood as the binding agent for the covenant that we live in, which is in verse 7 of chapter 8 of Hebrews, says is a better covenant. And well, let's read something. Let's read chapter 8, and then we'll dissect this as we go, and through 8, 9, and 10, and then we'll get into some of these things relevant to the new covenant, and bring this thing to a head so we can understand exactly where we're at in the covenant, why our covenant is so much better than the covenant that they had. You want to read chapter 8, and we'll start through here. And if you see a point where we need to discuss it, let's just stop and discuss it.
Well, I'm not going to get very far, am I? Now of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. We have such an high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, and not man. For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, wherefore it is of necessity that this man have somewhat also to offer. For if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law, who serve under the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For, see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern showed to thee in the mount. Look, we better probably stop there and deal with some of that. I know, I know there's a whole bunch in there, and we've only got another 10 minutes or so to deal with here.
In this one, yeah.
But it's bringing it's bringing out here the writer to the Hebrews was talking to people who understood the law. They understood what we're talking about of the yearly ritual and actually the daily ritual that went through the Jewish life. The Hebrews' life was built around ritual. If you get an opportunity to go through a Passover Seder sometime, with light of the New Covenant, and see the ritual that was there, and see the type and shadow brought out and played out, avail yourself of it, because and they were dealing with the writer to the Hebrews here is writing to a group of people that understands this, and he's saying he's bringing out the fact that Jesus is the one that is in this new covenant, and he's bringing out the fact that here it was the priest, and all that the priest did and all of the work that they had to do was done because there was a heavenly reality that was behind what God told Moses to do.
Exactly.
As you go back through and see the pattern, as it says here, that God gave to him to establish this physical temple, the tabernacle at that time, to establish that as that place, and the type and shadow that plays into it, the covering of it, the wood, the implements of it, and all of it points toward something better. And what it was as it said here, it was that heavenly pattern, that heavenly blueprint that God had to bring. God didn't just do this and then think, well, a couple thousand years have gone through here, we probably ought to do something different. No, he had a plan and a purpose in mind when he established this, and it was so that he could open this up further as he progressed over into the new covenant. And so as we go through here, then he's talking about these various things that the priest did, and now that Jesus was doing, and how it was establishing more there. Okay.
Well, I just want to inject this as food for thought. When you're reading this, we got to remember that they were dealing in the physical, but now God is starting to say, hey, these physical things had spiritual significance behind them for the reason for this detail that he gave to the building of this tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and all these other things relevant to that covenant with Abraham.
He wasn't just pulling them out of thin air somewhere.
Right. It had a purpose.
There was a real purpose for it. But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, speaking about Jesus, of course, by how much more also he is a mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. For if the first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord.
That opens a lot of doors.
Yeah, it does.
You want to jump in here and add something?
The aspect here, verse 6, but now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry. You could really go back clear up into the 7th chapter and even some of the 6th chapters, because that spells out that Jesus was made a high priest like Melchizedek.
Right.
One without end in that regard. And that's what that first verse of chapter 8 talks about. Now the things which we have spoken of, this is the sum. He's already spoken about them, but then he goes and reiterates again, just like you brought out. So he's obtained a more excellent ministry than even Melchizedek.
That's right.
And he's the mediator of the better covenant. He not only well, when I think of mediator, you think of someone who is the go-between
Yes.
to reconcile two parties together.
That's right.
In a labor dispute, you have
Right.
a mediator
Right.
over how much salary they get. Say if you work for a municipality, they have a mediator that goes between the labor unions and the municipalities to decide how they're gonna get their union dues or all this other stuff. And that's what Jesus was doing, but he was not only a mediator between men, he was a mediator between God and man.
That's right.
So that again is why he obtained a more excellent ministry than even Melchizedek. And then
In the next program, we want to bring out some more of this relationship between Jesus, the covenant, and God and man. An aspect that we haven't talked about yet, but we will in the next program. But go ahead and wrap up where you're at, so
Well,
this is good.
in the 7th verse there, it of course 6 it says it was established on better
promises, yes.
So he brought in the better promises, which we can sit here and read. You know, they didn't have that for a while. The first covenant, if it had been faultless, he would have not had to replace it. But because the man who could fulfill that covenant had not come into the earth,
That's right.
he had to bring in a new covenant through Jesus Christ, who was the one that would come.
Well, this was actually the groundwork of God to the bringing forth of the sinless man, naming Jesus.
Yeah.
It was preparatory, knowing that this covenant would be replaced because it was only pointing out the differences.
Yeah, it's actually, Hebrews here is a looking back
Yes.
into the prophetic
Yes.
of the Old Testament,
Absolutely.
which spoke that, well, like in verse 10, this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. All these things had to take place so he could make that new covenant
Yes.
with the house of Israel, and we get in on it too,
Absolutely.
which is good.
I'm
so.
glad I'm in this generation.
Oh, yes, yeah, and so it just brings in the context. All Hebrews is rich. You know?
Oh, amen.
Boy, it's rich. Let's see. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them. what a phrase, you know, to lead them out of Egypt, and because they continued not in my covenant, they had broken God's covenant that he had made with them.
And we talked about in one of the other programs the significance of that, the fact that God no longer showed up as a little furnace, but here was the pillar.
That's right.
I mean, it was very clear to them that he was present.
Yeah.
And his mercy
Yeah.
was involved in this because they had broken the covenant.
Yes.
And that goes back also to, and brings in another aspect of the blood over the lintels of the doorpost, which also ties back into covenant. Another thing leading up to what we celebrate as communion, which
Yeah.
we'll talk about as we go further through this.
Yeah.
And there again, you know, tune in again because we're running out of time in this program as we do in every one of them. Seems like. Each one of us could spend 30 minutes, let alone all three of us. But it's dealing with the fact that under the law they were sin conscious. All of this typology was done to let them see how awesome sin was and how bad it was, and the fact that under that old covenant, that was all it was dealt with, was sin, and it was sin consciousness. Now, as we come into the new covenant, we become God conscious rather than sin conscious. And one of the things that we need to see is how that new covenant makes us righteous, where the old one just showed them all the law could do was show them that they were sinners and that they were failing. And you know, that's why the priest went in with the blood and all of the sacrifice and everything that was done. But we now, through Christ, through this better covenant, on better promises, we are made righteousness conscious, because we're on the other side of the sacrifice. We should be thinking more about our righteousness and as ministers, ministering more righteousness so that people are righteousness conscious rather than sin conscious.
Amen.
And that's where we also go back to where we talked about in earlier programs of being intimate. They didn't have the privilege of being intimate with a God like we do. It just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Where now, we not only are intimate, he's in us. I mean, you can't get much more intimate than that.
That's right.
But we have to bring it past the sense realm into the spiritual realm.
They were intimate with the law, but they were
But
not
not
intimate
in with God.
with
The law was
yeah,
only the
that's right.
schoolmaster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right, exactly.
We're
You
about
wanna
on time.
wrap this one up, you guys?
Well, just tune in again next time to the program because we got some good things to share with you.
Amen.
Amen.